At a university graduation party, a mysterious elderly woman suddenly appeared. She completely ignored the strange looks around her. With a clear goal, she walked straight toward the man at the center of the party. The man turned around and was startled by the sight before him, but before he could react, the woman shoved something into his hand and said something very strange. "Come back to me." After saying that, she turned and walked away under everyone's gaze. Her back seemed full of unspeakable loneliness, leaving Richard confused and clueless, because he was certain he had never met this old woman. Looking down, he saw there was a watch in his hand. Clearly, it wasn't an ordinary item. Richard had no idea why she gave it to him. After the strange scene, the party carried on in full swing, but Richard was completely unaware that later that night, on the way home, the elderly woman was shedding tears, as if she had finally fulfilled a long-held wish. She locked herself in her room, listened to a familiar song one last time, gazed out the window at an unforgettable scene, holding an unpublished script in her arm. The old woman passed away on the sofa just like that. Spring passed, autumn came. In the blink of an eye, 8 years had passed. Richard was no longer the inexperienced student he once was. He had established his place in society and fulfilled his dream of becoming a playwright. Path IES, a famous work, hung on the wall. Path IES was the script that woman had held that day. But lately, Richard had been lacking inspiration. Even soothing music couldn't calm his restless mind. So Richard packed his things and decided to take a spontaneous trip. But unfortunately, as he stepped downstairs, he ran into his boss chasing a manuscript. His excitement about the trip was completely ruined. Then, driving his sports car through a city full of skyscrapers, Richard felt incredibly suffocated. So he decided to head to the countryside for some fresh air. Unexpectedly, on this rural road, there was a rather large hotel. Though he had never been there before, Richard felt an odd sense of familiarity. So, from a spontaneous trip, he suddenly decided to stay a few days, completely unaware that the hotel called Grand was once the old residence of that woman. The gears of fate quietly began to turn. After checking in, Richard was greeted by an old man with white hair named Arthur. Arthur had worked at the hotel with his father since he was 5. Even though he was often scolded for playing ball in the lobby as a child, Arthur had been attached to this place his whole life and knew every little corner of the hotel. He picked for Richard the room with the best view and said to come find him if he needed anything. But before leaving, Arthur couldn't help but ask, "Haven't we met before?" "I don't think so." "No? I guess not either. Have a pleasant stay, sir." Richard instinctively checked the time. That watch, he still kept it to this day. Soon, Richard felt a gnawing hunger. He went down to the first-floor restaurant for something to eat, but was told it wouldn't open for another 40 minutes. Helplessly, Richard wandered around. By chance, he stepped into a museum. The artifacts here had existed for over 100 years. Undoubtedly, it was a great place to seek inspiration. Suddenly, Richard froze on the spot. He felt a gaze following him. Unable to resist, he turned around and discovered the source of that gaze. It was a portrait of a beautiful woman. The woman in the painting seemed to have been waiting for Richard for a long time, so much so that when he unconsciously stepped closer, the light around him seemed to glow intensely. She was breathtakingly stunning, heartbreakingly beautiful. One look was enough to leave Richard unable to forget her, but when he looked down, there was no information about her at all. Richard rushed to find Arthur for answers, and got the answer. That is Miss Elise. She used to be a famous actress of that era. She once performed a play at this hotel's theater. Richard felt deeply disappointed, because that play happened nearly 70 years ago. No matter how fascinated he was with Elise, it was useless, because he and she had met at the wrong time. In the following days, Richard tossed and turned restlessly, staring at the portrait, unable to walk away. Finally, on the day he was supposed to leave, Richard decided, at the very least, he could put Elise into his new play. In a burst of inspiration, he rushed to the local library to search for all available information about Elise. Just as Arthur had said, with the guidance of manager William, Elise was once a rising star, but later on, she was no longer seen in public. Without the stage, her personal life became nearly reclusive. Therefore, information about Elise was extremely scarce. Richard practically tore through the entire library. Until late at night, he finally found a clue in an old magazine. At that moment, Richard almost gasped out loud, because in a photo of Elise in her final years, she looked exactly like the woman who gave him the watch 8 years ago at the graduation party, following the lead in the magazine. Early the next morning, Richard visited the article's author, Mrs. Laura. He introduced himself as a playwright, and said he wanted to adapt Elise's life into a stage play. Unexpectedly, the woman immediately tried to shut the door and send him away. Helpless, Richard had to reveal the real reason. Then, he showed Laura the pocket watch. Seeing the pocket watch, Laura finally let Richard into the house. Turns out she was a theater enthusiast, and had collected many stage relics from that time. Among them were costumes and relics of Elise. Memories slowly returned to Laura's mind. It was said that in her youth, Elise was optimistic, lively, and full of life. But after a performance in 1912, she changed completely. No one knew what had happened, not even her closest manager, William. Or perhaps it was something that couldn't be revealed. From then on, Elise became melancholic, as if something was missing. Suddenly, Richard saw a familiar science fiction book in the corner of the room. The book was titled A Journey Through Time. Its author was his university philosophy professor, but the woman told Richard that Elise had read that book over and over again before her death. Then she brought out a music box handcrafted by Elise herself, inspired by the Grand Hotel, and when the music box played, it was Richard's favorite piece of music. Everything felt far too coincidental. Richard found it hard to believe. He was certain there was some connection between him and Elise, so Richard immediately sought out his professor, because he had once mentioned a secret experiment about time travel. Back then, Richard didn't care, but what he was going through now made him reconsider. Perhaps there was a way for him to travel through time and meet Elise. It's just that the time travel incident had been too random. Even the professor wasn't sure if he had truly gone to the past. It might have lasted only a blink, or just 10 minutes. The professor told Richard that he was staying in a very old inn at the time, so old, even the air felt frozen in time. Everything around him, including the inn, looked like it came from 100 years ago. He lay on the bed like that, holding a coin from the era he wanted to visit. After repeatedly hypnotizing himself, he felt he had truly traveled through time. But upon returning, he felt drained. No matter how hard he tried, he could never replicate it again. Perhaps to others, it sounded like nonsense. But after hearing this, Richard immediately took action. He bought coins from the year 1912, and even prepared a suit and hairstyle fitting that era. As it happened, the Grand Hotel had existed for over a century. The interior hadn't changed much either. All Richard had to do was record his voice, then lie on the bed and begin self-hypnosis. If nothing unexpected happened, he would soon time travel. But things weren't as simple as Richard imagined. He lay there all day, until sweat soaked his forehead, until the recorder jammed. In his despair, he realized he couldn't do it. Looking at the portrait on the wall, Richard felt completely helpless. But then, the guest book at the reception desk sparked a glimmer of hope. Richard woke up the sleeping Arthur. He needed to know where the other guest books were. Finally, after searching for a while, he found the guest book from the year 1912, covered in dust in the attic. It clearly showed that Elise had actually stayed at this hotel. Richard held his breath and turned the next page. He almost didn't dare to look directly. And then something miraculous happened, just as Richard had boldly speculated. On the next page, his name was clearly written. Richard had actually returned 70 years into the past. This time, he had no more hesitation. He no longer needed hypnosis, because this was a truth that had already happened. When Richard opened his eyes again, the surroundings had completely changed. He had succeeded. After checking everything on him, Richard still couldn't believe his eyes. Suddenly, a woman's voice echoed behind him. Richard hurriedly hid in the wardrobe. Turns out, he had time traveled into the living room of another hotel room. While no one was looking, Richard quickly slipped out. Using the information from the guest book, he found Elise's room, but the maid just saw him as one of many admirers, and politely declined all of Richard's requests. As he disappointedly walked down to the lobby, the scene before him left him stunned. He never imagined the Grand Hotel 70 years ago would be so luxurious, not only bustling, but mostly filled with high society. Suddenly, a ball rolled into Richard's hand. As he was about to return it, a voice shouted, "No playing ball indoors, Arthur." Richard was stunned. The young boy in front of him was the same Arthur who had welcomed him. No wonder Arthur once asked if they had met before. After that, Richard went to the theater, but the reaction from everyone was the same, because at that time, too many people were infatuated with Elise. The performers were used to it. They looked at Richard indifferently, so Richard decided to knock on each dressing room door. Unexpectedly, he encountered a lonely woman. Her eyes looked like they could devour him. Fortunately, he still managed to get an important piece of information. In front of the Grand Hotel was a wide seaside area. Elise apparently loved walking there alone. Richard slowly walked forward. From afar, he saw a figure he had never seen before, but he was certain it was her. She seemed to be searching for something, until Richard appeared before her. This was a fated encounter, a meeting that was destined. Their timelines intertwined at this very moment. Truly, she was worthy of being called the great beauty of the 80s. Elise's beauty had caused many to fall hopelessly for her. Their meeting had barely begun when a stern voice cut in. It was Elise's manager, William. William didn't even allow Elise to turn around. He knew Richard was still standing behind them. In a firm voice, he told Richard to abandon all foolish thoughts. But Elise still stole a glance back, etching Richard's face deep into her memory. And Richard, after all the hardship of finding Elise, how could he give up so easily over a few warnings? He snuck into the ballroom during dinner, and ran to dance with her, even though the two hadn't met yet. Elise instinctively tried to step back, but something about the man felt so familiar to her, so she decided to stay. But just as their eyes met again at last, William showed up again at the worst moment, ordering the guards to throw Richard out immediately. But Elise was not someone to back down easily. She declared that she would go with with him. They hurried out into the hallway. Elise found out that Richard was a playwright. She was sure he couldn't possibly know everything about her, but Richard was curious. Why did Elise ask, "Is it you, by the riverside?" However, William's suspicious gaze appeared behind them. Elise had no choice but to walk away. She didn't even know when they would meet again. William noticed something different about Elise when she smiled to herself in front of the mirror. Later, William reminded Elise not to let this affect her focus for tomorrow night's performance. Since there were no vacant rooms, Richard had to sleep on a bench outside in the courtyard. Early in the morning, he sneaked back into the hotel to avoid being seen by William. Sure enough, because it was so early, the person who opened the door was Elise. They spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to break the brief and beautiful moment, and he gently asked when he could see her again. However, Richard's frequent appearances made William feel threatened. He warned that whether Richard was trying to steal Elise away, or was just obsessed with her beauty, if Richard acted out of line again, he would not hesitate to act. Richard ignored the warning. He went to the reception desk to check in. According to the attic guest book, today was the day he officially checked in, but strangely, the room given to him by reception did not match what was written in the book. Richard immediately asked if there was a mistake. Luckily, another staff member pointed out that room had already been reserved. Richard finally got the correct room, then signed his name on the correct page in the guest book. Everything unfolded exactly as he had hoped. Richard didn't forget to quietly hand the ball to little Arthur, who was crying in the corner of the room. At that moment, Elise arrived on time, but William was still closely following her, so they got into a carriage and said goodbye to the predator behind them. They strolled along the beach. Warm sunlight spread across the green grass. Nothing had to be forced. Richard told her many things about the future, about future cars, future cities, about how mankind had even set foot on the moon. But Elise just saw it as the whimsical imagination of a young playwright. Compared to all that, she preferred quietly watching the one she loved, among the waves crashing onto soft sand, under the red and white lighthouse. Becoming an actress wasn't easy. Luckily, she had William's help, but at the same time, William controlled her, especially when any man tried to approach her. William always claimed he could see the future, and that a man would one day ruin her, so Elise always kept her distance from all men. But Richard knew William couldn't see the future, because according to the newspapers, he had died in a car crash later in life. Scene transition. Richard softly hummed his favorite melody. Elise found the tune beautiful. Richard casually mentioned the composer's name. To his surprise, Elise had met that person at a concert, but she had never heard that melody. Elise didn't know the tune came from the future. That afternoon passed in the laughter of Elise. At that moment, Richard gave her his watch. Elise was deeply grateful to Richard. It was the most wonderful afternoon of her life, but perhaps after today, they wouldn't meet again, because after tonight, the entire theater troupe would leave to perform in a faraway play. Hearing that, Richard felt great sorrow. They entered the room together, and in their most emotional moment, they shared their first kiss. But right at that crucial moment, William appeared and ruined everything. Seeing the scene inside the room, William immediately understood what had happened. Perhaps he had been secretly watching for a long time. Scene change. Night quickly fell. The stage curtain slowly opened. The auditorium was packed with audience members. No matter how many mixed emotions there were, once on stage, Elise immediately embodied her role. All the actors followed the script exactly. If nothing went wrong, the play would end smoothly. But suddenly, Elise got lost in thought and spoke. "The man in my dreams is now almost gone." "What kind of man is that, miss?" "He's the man I created in my mind. That man is a figure every woman secretly longs for deep in her heart. I love you. If you're really here, these are the words I want to say to you." Perhaps it wasn't Richard who tried his best to return to the past, but Elise who made it all happen. Her longing brought the man of her dreams to her from the future. She desired it so much that it pulled him into her world. But Elise's improvisation didn't ruin the play. On the contrary, her sincerity moved the entire audience. The photographer eagerly tried to capture the perfect ending shot, but couldn't find a truly natural expression, until Elise looked at Richard, and everything became real for her in that moment. Richard suddenly remembered. That photo was taken the moment Elise saw him. No wonder it felt familiar, and why he could feel the intensity in her gaze. Just before Act 2 began, Richard received a confrontational letter from William. They agreed to meet outside the hotel, and William unleashed bitter words upon him. William had devoted his entire life to Elise. He believed that if she followed his plan, she would become a legendary star, and he would also go down in history. So William would never allow Elise to escape his control. She had to dedicate her life to the stage. Richard proposed a compromise. Elise could continue her tours around the country. He just wanted to be by her side, but that crossed William's line. His possessiveness left no room for any other man. From the moment Richard accepted the challenge, the outcome was already sealed. After the show, Elise grew extremely anxious, because no matter where she searched, Richard was nowhere to be found, until William appeared at her door. Elise immediately realized he had done something. William once again used his old threats to try and scare her, but William couldn't believe that now, Elise was ready to defy him for another man. man. But at this point, the troupe was set to leave in just 1 hour. No matter how long Elise waited, it was in vain. When Richard woke up, he found himself tied up and thrown into a carriage. The sky was already bright. After struggling free and returning to the hotel, he found the place completely deserted. The front desk had no idea where the troupe had gone. Richard turned away in despair. Little Arthur could only watch his back for a long time. Richard sat leaning against the hotel, his heart filled with unspeakable loneliness. He seemed to feel the deep sorrow Elise had felt in old age. That feeling of loving deeply but being unable to be together. But would fate really let their love end like this? Right then, a voice called out to Richard from afar. It was Elise. Somehow, she had returned to the hotel. They embraced tightly. This time, no one stood between them. They completely accepted one another. In that small room, Richard and Elise shared the happiest moments of their lives. Elise, like a little girl, asked Richard if he would marry her. She was eager to know everything about his life. She wanted to hear about the plays he wrote, and hoped to be the lead in them, whether on stage or in real life. The golden pocket watch became their token of love. Richard stood up. He showed off the vintage suit that he had specially bought from an antique shop just to meet her. But when he reached into his pocket, he unexpectedly found a coin from 1979, something that didn't belong to this era, just like he himself didn't belong in this play. After that, his time travel journey came to an end. Richard felt the whole world spinning around him. When he opened his eyes, he was drenched in sweat and exhausted. He had been pulled back to the future, leaving Elise behind. Richard refused to give up. He hurriedly climbed back onto the bed, but he had forgotten. The professor once said that even now, he still couldn't return to the past again. Time travel is like a dream from which we are bound to awaken. No matter how hard you try to keep dreaming, it's useless. Something, once missed, can never come back. Only beautiful memories and the pain of being apart remain. Elise waited her whole life for the man who changed her destiny, not knowing where he came from. He appeared like the wind and vanished like a mystery. So she began to believe in time travel. She remembered the plays he had told her about, the melodies he softly hummed. And so she waited, until wrinkles covered her face, her hair turned white, but the man she loved remained as youthful as ever. When they met again, they no longer recognized each other. As if separated by a lifetime, she had waited 70 years, just to once again return her love, to the version of herself from long ago. When old Arthur noticed something strange and broke in, Richard was found in a near-death state from starvation. Strangely, when the doctor shined a flashlight on him, the light flared. Richard suddenly smiled mysteriously, because within that light, he saw someone who had been waiting for him through all the years across time. There is a magical connection between people, even without knowing each other. In the moment their eyes meet, they know this is the one they've waited for all their life. Pure and sincere love is rare. It becomes even more beautiful and fragile in a harsh reality. I hope you'll be just as lucky that someone will appear like magic in your life. Some say this film is illogical. That is a time travel story. It's full of plot holes. It can't withstand logical analysis, nor is the emotion deep enough. But love itself is a loop of illogic. Sometimes, a single glance is enough to fall deeply. This film was released in 1980. It was the first live-action movie to bring time travel to the screen. It also has another title, that is Somewhere in Time. A name as dreamy as the story itself. Somewhere in time, someone is waiting for you. I believe that. No one in this world was born to be alone. Either you go searching, or you peacefully wait. Among millions of people, you will meet the one you're meant to meet. Across millions of years, in the wild vastness of time. Not a step too soon, not a second too late. If time could truly turn back, who would be the one waiting for you in memory? This concludes the film Somewhere in Time. I hope that anyone feeling lonely after watching this movie will find more joy in everyday life and heal your heart to find peace. I'm Nee. Thank you and see you again in the next episode.